Welcome to another episode of the Spoon Mob podcast. This week I'm joined by sommelier Jared Krauss, who is the wine director over at Agni here in Columbus, Ohio. Agni opened earlier this year. It is Avishar Barua's second restaurant. Joya's was his first, and Joya's wasn't supposed to be a restaurant really and became its own thing. It's kind of daytime cafe lunch spot, and Agni is his evening spot. Tasting menu, they do have an a la carte component to it as well, but they got a little chef's counter back in the kitchen that you can go to, open fire. Really awesome restaurant. It's in the brewery district, stone's throw from Lawbird, like right around the corner, a street over from Chapman's Eat Market too as well. So right off a high street there. So if you've never been, make sure to check it out. It's awesome time, awesome experience. We'll most likely win, I would assume, best new restaurant for Columbus because it opened this year too as well when those local awards start coming out and everything. And who knows? We've been in twice, had a great time both times, did the tasting menu and everything. Which was awesome. And then had some bar bites too when we were on our way to another event and stopped in and got to see Jared and Avishar and them. The wine list there is amazing. It's maybe the best wine list in the city for a restaurant. Like, it's awesome. Just the different stuff they have on there. Super unique, but not overly complicated, not really going to scare you either if you don't really understand it. As somebody who's kind of going through the wine stuff now, when I got a chance to take a look at the wine list when we were at the bar area, it was just, there's just stuff on there that nobody else in the city kind of has, it feels like. So Jared is from, the area and, went to Ohio State, spent a bunch of time at the refectory. So Taylor Wolf, Chris Dillman have spent time there too as well. And then he went out west and worked at some Michelin places, Gary Danko and everything, and wound up going through all that and coming back and wound up at Agni and is running the wine program there. And it's awesome. So again, stop in if you haven't. It's an awesome new spot, adding to kind of this collection of chef-driven, owned restaurants that are popping up here in Columbus, which is great to see. You look at Cincinnati, you look at Detroit. We've kind of said it time and time again on this podcast, but those cities, they have amazing food scenes that people don't really know about because they are so individually driven from the ownership standpoint, from the people running the restaurants and everything. It's not big corporate chains, though you can find those elements, the corporate kind of chain element in those cities. But for so long, Columbus was kind of dominated by the Cameron Mitchell restaurant group and still is to some effect. They have a lot of successful restaurants around town, consistent too as well. We've had a few different alumni on the podcast over the years that have spent time there. But, even with them opening more and more restaurants, it does feel like there is a shift here in Columbus to more individual kind of chef-owned restaurants, which is something that's just great to see. And I think the city desperately needs it. So hopefully we keep on that trajectory. It was just kind of a blip and a slowdown because of COVID, which affected every restaurant scene in every city. But yeah, more cool stuff I think is on the way here. But Agni is definitely one of those things. And Jared's doing amazing things over there too as well. So you can follow him on Instagram at Krauss.Jared. So KRAUSS.Jared is his handle. You can also follow the restaurant Agni. It's at Dine at Agni. Reservations for them are on Talk too as well. The bar, you don't need reservations. You can just kind of walk in. I think we went early on a Saturday. We were before 7 and it was pretty much wide open. So it just kind of depends on what's going on in the city, but you might be able to just kind of walk in if you're just looking for the bar area and just want to pull some small bites and stuff like that and have a drink or two. But you definitely need reservations for the chef's counter in the back, which they do. And then also, the tasting menu and everything too as well. So you just go to Talk and you can find them there. Make sure to follow us on Instagram too as well at Spoon Mob. You can check out our website, spoonmob.com. Profiles for all our guests are up there on the website. Links to all the episodes that they've been on, any new information, updates since they've been on the podcast too as well. We put up there photos of food, the restaurant, wine, all that stuff you can find. There's a contact portal where you can write in questions, comments, feedback too as well. You can also email us directly, spoonmob@yahoo.com, and just poke around the website. It's always getting updated, always new things getting added, food photos, what have you. Just added some photos from Good Eats here in Columbus too as well. So those are up there. And a few other things too. Hiraeth we added to as well. So eventually that stuff makes its way to Instagram, but it always hits the website first. So you want to just kind of periodically check in there. As for following the podcast, make sure to do so. We're on all the platforms: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Samsung, Amazon Music, any podcast platform you can find us. We post links. You can use our Instagram bio. There's a link in there with the link tree. That'll take you to where you need to go. All the individual episodes, we post links in our stories too as well. Or you can go to the preferred player and just search Spoon Mob and we'll come up. And then you can click the little check mark follow button and all the new episodes will drop straight into your feed as soon as they release. Usually come out on Thursdays at 1 a.m. Sometimes we have some mini update episodes with returning guests. Those usually drop on Tuesdays. So just kind of randomly, it's whenever we have them recorded and push them out. That's why you kind of want to be followed so you don't miss anything. And you can check out our YouTube channel too as well. We put all the episodes up there about a week after they debut on the podcast platform. So if YouTube is your preferred player podcast method, you can go ahead and subscribe to our channel there. And you'll get alerted as soon as a new episode releases and gets uploaded there too as well. Also, make sure to vote for us for Best Community Partner, the Ohio Restaurant Industry Awards, the Ohio Restaurant Association. They do annual awards. We are up for Best Community Partner, one of 4 finalists, I guess, in that category. Make sure if you get a chance, if you haven't already, to go to their website, click on the awards voting. It'll give you a little drop-down ballot, and you go through each of like the 5 or 6 categories and select from. It's like best restaurants, North, Central, South, best community partner, I think best behind the scenes person, and there's I think maybe one other category too as well that I'm blanking on is up there. So it's like 5 or 6 categories. Quick drop-down. You have through the end of the month to vote. So please do so if you haven't. And if you have, I think you can go vote again if you'd like. I don't think there's a limit or anything like that. But please, if you get a chance, go ahead and vote for us up there. That'd be cool to see. And yeah, that's it for kind of updates. So with that, here is the conversation with sommelier and wine director Jared Krauss, who you can find over at Agni here in Columbus, Ohio. Cool. Well, thanks again for taking some time coming on the podcast here to talk about your career, what you're doing now with Agni. I want to get into all that too, and how you wound up there and what you got going on with pairings and the uniqueness of the food and everything. But I always like to kind of start at the beginning with everyone. How did you kind of first find yourself getting involved with wine? Was it just something that you kind of fell into, or was it a byproduct of working in restaurants in high school? Like, how did all that kind of materialize and happen for you?
Thanks for having me on the podcast, right? Most sommeliers I've met in my life accidentally ended up in wine. I was going to Ohio State University here in Columbus, needed a part-time job for, weekend beer money. So I found myself at a really legacied restaurant here in the city called The Refectory. I think you've talked to a couple Refectory, Taylor, who's the current wine director, and Chris Dillman as well. So I'm 19, 20, 21 years old. My weekends are all ramen and hot dogs and natty light. And then I go into this classic like temple to French fine dining food. There's foie gras, there's truffles, and there's first growth Bordeaux. When I started there, we had Mouton Rothschild going back to the 50s on the wine list. I just had this fortuitous kind of surrounding. And eventually, as I graduated from college, my original goal was law school, took the LSAT. I got into law schools, but then just right at the 11th hour decided it wasn't for me. And I felt a little bit lost and just stayed in the hospitality industry over the course of a decade. And, sometimes it was part-time, sometimes it was full-time. I was playing around with different careers, but I went from bussing tables at the Refectory when I was 19 years old to being the wine director there. I think I was 28 when I became the wine director.
It's funny because we've had a bunch of people on that have gone to either medical school or law school. And just as soon as they get there, they're like, I don't really want to do this. So for you, was there a singular moment that you're like, this is not the path that I want to continue down?
It's funny. I have 2 sommeliers that work with me right now at Agni, and both of them also intended to go to law school, got their undergrad, and then changed course. And now, years later are doing wine. I spent my last, I think, 2 summers of college doing document processing, like clerk jobs, basically at some law firms here in Columbus. And it just was not the fit for me. The environment of a larger law firm, especially coming from restaurants where it's so, even a place as polished as like a fine dining restaurant, you go behind the scenes. It's very casual. It's almost like you're hanging out with friends, you're getting drinks after work, and then you go to a law firm environment and it's very polished. And I remember clearly my first day at one of the law firms, as I was being walked around the office, introduced to every single handshake was that classic like dick measuring contest handshake where they're trying to like crush your hand. And I realized that, the first one was like, oh, okay, this guy, that's just how he asserts dominance. But then it was like 12 in a row, men and women, every single handshake. And I realized that was just the culture there, and that was not for me at all.
So when you're in school, you wind up working at the refectory, like you mentioned. How did you wind up there? Was that just they were hiring somebody and you were like, all right, I need a job?
Yeah. This was 2007 when I started there. So it's definitely before a lot of the job board postings that you could kind of search nowadays. I want to say I saw an ad in print in a newspaper, like either the Dispatch or maybe it was the OSU student newspaper, the Lantern. I don't 100% remember, but I'm pretty sure it was a actual in print job posting in a newspaper somewhere. And I just responded to it and interviewed. And I still remember Kamal, who's the owner of the refectory for I think like 40 years now. He asked me a question about something about what I didn't like about service. And I'd done casual restaurant jobs before. And I just gave the worst possible answer. I mean, I went off for like just rambling, like 7 minute long. Here's what I get annoyed about at service. And in retrospect, I always think like, why would you have hired me? Like I sounded like someone who just hated working in restaurants, but it ended up working out, I guess.
You're at the refectory for a number of years.
It was a decade.
That's not normal for people to be at one restaurant that long, especially starting so early in your career, in your wine journey. How did that happen? Was it just like, this is a great place to be, a great environment? Like there's no reason to even look at other opportunities because they just don't compare?
It was some of that. And honestly, the refectory, there were people, a gentleman just passed away a couple of weeks actually, who was one of my sort of like early mentors. His name was John Saunders, and he worked at the refectory for I think 41 years. And there's people that I worked with that started around the same time I did, or a couple of years after, that are still there today. So there's definitely a tradition of people being at that restaurant for longer than most restaurants are open. There's the community of it, I think, because you do have that established core of people working. That's just an attractive thing to be a part of. At the time in the early 2010s, late aughts, the restaurant scene in Columbus, there weren't a lot of other comparable high-end things going on. And I found out that was really what I enjoyed. I didn't want to go back to some sort of casual restaurant. I'd worked at like, O'Charlie's and Olive Garden before, and that was not my vibe. And then once I started getting into wine, there was nowhere else. There was nowhere else in the city that afforded the same sort of opportunities with wine that I had there.
So what was it that like hooked you in wine? Because you wind up at the refectory. Were you into wine before that, or was it that kind of like a byproduct of being there?
Definitely a byproduct of being there. I was into beer, actually. So we had a general manager / wine director. His name was Jeff Alasky, and he admittedly did not know much about beer. And so when I was 21, maybe 22, he turned over the beer program to me at the ref because I was just really into it. I'd grown up in Portland, Oregon, which is obviously a large craft beer city. And especially, again, we're talking 2009, 2010, a little bit before the craft beer boom really blows up around the country. But there were pockets of it in Portland and a couple of up in Michigan, obviously. So I came from one of those. I fell in love with beer, and that was my intro into beverage at the refectory. And then as I was continuing sort of curating the beer selection there, I had goals of becoming a server. And at the time, there was no sommelier. All servers handled their own wine service in their sections. And if you have, 500 selections in a wine list and you're expected to handle your own wine service, the knowledge that was expected of the service staff there was pretty high. So when I came to Jeff and said, I want to serve, he said, okay, cool. You don't know anything about wine, so you can't, but let's get you there. Let's see what we can do to build up your knowledge and get to a point where I'm comfortable having you have those wine interactions with guests. So he started inviting me to taste with sales reps when they came into the restaurant. He started sending me to all of the trade tastings around the city, gave me a couple of books to read. And I think over the course of about a year, I started like really gaining a strong level of knowledge of wine and just exposure to all of that. And then I distinctly remember a rep coming in to taste the new vintage of Jean-Marc Burcard Chablis. And he brought the whole lineup up to their Grand Cru Le Clos vineyard. And we're tasting through from Village level Chablis all the way up. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, Village Chablis, it's nice, it's enjoyable. Premier Cru, oh, this is pretty good. And then we tasted the Grand Cru, and I was like, holy shit. Like, wine is awesome. Like, it clicked in my mind. That was really the start.
You're there for a number of years. Did you get to a point where you wanted to work your way up? And like you said, you wanted to become a server, but from there, like once you're on the floor, like, did you want to become a wine director there one day? Like, was that an ultimate goal, or is that just something that just kind of happened?
It really happened. It was, in the midst of my 20s, I was like, I think a lot of people, just searching for what was the right fit for me, and tried a couple of different things. Like I said, for some time I was part-time at the refectory serving, as I worked for Big Brothers Big Sisters within Columbus City schools for a while. Went through like the firefighter like hiring process. I was just like jumping around experimenting with stuff, and nothing ever stuck. The whole time I just kept learning more about wine. I kept tasting more great wine. Eventually, I can't remember the timeline, but I had decided that wine was really like my passion, and I did want to pursue it. And then Jeff, the wine director, became very ill and had to step down from his role pretty abruptly. And we were just in a place staffing wise at the restaurant where Kamal approached me and said, I know you don't have any management experience, but you have the respect of everyone on the team here, and we're willing to help you sort of learn the ropes of what running the wine program would be like. And so offered me the position. Had actually never wanted really to be a restaurant manager. I think, when you're in your 20s and you think about managing restaurants, some people love it. Some people dive into it right away, but there's always this idea of like, oh, I don't want to manage. I know how tough all of our service staff make it on the management team, and I don't want that. But at that point, I'd been there 8 years. I'd gone from a teenager into my late 20s, and it really felt like a place I'd grown up within those walls, and I was pretty much family with the team there. So since there was definitely it was sort of like an emergency time, so I took that opportunity. And then from there, once you're the wine director of a place like that, the opportunities to learn more about wine, to taste more wine, just explode.
During that time, that process, are you taking any wine exams and certifications, or does that come later?
Later, yeah. I was already running the wine program for maybe a year or so before I took the first quartermaster sommelier's intro sommelier test. And I just I felt like maybe I should, obviously I worked with him on and off at the refectory. And so I saw his path to testing for master sommelier over the years. And I never really did it. But once I was in that role, I thought maybe, I don't know, maybe it would give me a little more credibility, because I was pretty young. I was still in my 20s. And so I took the intro exam, about a year after I started running the wine program.
Why did you decide on the court versus one of the other organizations, either WSET or SWE? Like, what kind of led you down that path?
I think it's probably the influence from Chris, and just seeing the amount of work that he put into studying for the exams and how much knowledge he had sort of accumulated going down that path. Also, obviously, in restaurants, the service element that the court focuses on, it made more sense to have that as a part of it versus, like the WSET, which doesn't have that. And then, too, there was the structure of it. I don't really like school. Sitting in class is not my thing. So the chance to do a thing where I could just show up and take a test, and I didn't have to, versus the WSET where it's, in-person classes. I guess post-COVID, they've done a lot of online classes now. It just really appealed to me to be like, okay, I put in the work on my own time. I do the grind. I don't need to be in a classroom and sit down and do this formal thing, and then I can show up and take this test.
So when you take like the next level, like was there a part that was more difficult or challenging for you out of the three, service, tasting, theory? Like were there one of those three that you felt you had to focus extra more on?
Yeah, tasting's always been the weak point of the three for me. I don't think I'm a natural taster. I've gotten to the point where, well, I'm a really good blind taster, but it took just grinding and grinding and grinding, and it's by no means natural for me. But theory and service because I did the job, it came very easily. And then theory, I think a big part of beyond tasting that bottle that really hooked me. What One of the things that hooked me into sort of as a long-term thing was the opportunity to study every different field of, I don't know, everything, to really understand it. There's all of the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, geology, meteorology, etc. There's the social sciences, economics and history, and all of that. And so to branching down all those paths through the world of wine was super attractive to me. And as I was doing that, it turned out I was picking up all of the bits and pieces that would then translate to like a CMS theory exam.
Was there a region that was especially challenging for you? Italy, certain part of France?
Germany, I think Germany's always been a challenge. And it's partially because I just almost paradoxically, I just like all of the wine. I like almost everything that comes out of Germany. So it almost feels like, what's the point of studying? Like, I don't need to learn the different vineyards. All the vineyards are great. All of the Riesling is great. Every Pradicot level is great. So it almost made it harder because I just love all of it.
It's like 2017, you wind up going out west for a harvest intern at Martinelli Vineyard. So what led to that? Was winemaking something that you thought maybe this will be another path that I'll get into and go down?
I was definitely considering winemaking as kind of the next step of my career. My wife had just finished up her master's program in Ohio, and we were just sort of looking to make a move, leave Ohio. And so I was weighing options. Should I go to school, pursue a viticulture and enology degree? If I did that, where would we move to? And then she was trying to figure out fellowship opportunities at the same time. And eventually we just landed on the Bay Area, made the most sense for us. And like I already said, I'm not a big fan of school. So instead of going back to school, I thought, why don't I just do the job and see what I could learn about winemaking that way?
I'm assuming you went through the whole thing since you were there, I think from like August to February. So picking, processing, crushing, bottling, all that stuff. Was there a part of that that you enjoyed the most?
Honestly, the harvest, I really enjoyed almost all of it. Even most of winemaking is cleaning. 90% of it probably is just cleaning, and 10% of it's using the equipment that you cleaned and then cleaning it again. So obviously that can get a little bit mundane, but the everything about the harvest was really enjoyable. Getting the fruit in, tasting it, kind of processing it, putting it into the fermenters. We did inoculated ferments at Martinelli like most people do throughout California. So I got to build up the yeast starters and then start our fermentations, and also work on like the malolactic bacteria starters and secondary fermentations. Just all of that and the learning experience of it, having spent a decade serving people the wine, selling it, and then having the opportunity to see it on that end, I just really, really enjoyed. Not the hours. The hours are pretty brutal.
Is winemaking still something that you could envision yourself doing one day, after leaving restaurants, or is that time come and gone and you've had your fill of winemaking? And
Yeah, I don't know. There's a couple of sort of barriers to entry, I think. One is just like, if you're going to do your own thing, the finances you need to start up a winery, unless you're buying just really obscure varieties from, the Central Valley of California or something like that. But even then you have to invest in like, your fermentation tanks, you have to, all of that. So there's definitely a financial barrier to starting my own thing and then working under someone else. Maybe since I just started like a little bit older into the game, instead of like getting a viticulture and enology degree and jumping into it in my early 20s, I was making $15 an hour working for Martinelli, which was about the going rate in Sonoma in 2017. Sonoma was a really expensive place to live, and $15 an hour does not pay the bills. And so I think there's that sort of barrier to entry of like trying to grind and work your way up from the bottom, sort of, at my age and experience level. So I wouldn't say no, I don't want to do it, but there's definitely, it would have to be things that fall into place. And especially now being back in the Midwest, there's fewer opportunities to source super cool grapes.
So after you do harvest, you wind up staying on the West Coast, right? And you join Gary Danko as a sommelier. So was that intentional? You guys just wanted to stay out there? You're already kind of there, or what led to all that?
My wife had just finished up her master's degree and she was doing a fellowship in San Francisco. And the wine production, especially when you stop getting the overtime hours during harvest, was not paying the bills. And so I thought, well, I've got the skill set of working in restaurants. I know I could make pretty good money doing that. And it would be fun to find a place that would let me open up like unbelievable wine regularly, go work at a Michelin star restaurant and see what that is all about. So yeah, we had always intended to stay out on the West Coast for a while. Once we moved out there, I had originally thought I would stay in production longer than I did. No regrets joining the team at Gary Danko.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a decent amount of people who are sommeliers who've all spent time there. Is that just because like ownership, management, they're just super open in terms of people with little or no experience, but like as long as you have a desire to learn, they're willing to kind of bring you in and join the team kind of thing? Because they just seem more willing to bring people on than other restaurants in that area, I guess.
Gary Danko, they know who they are and what they're trying to do and what their standards are. And they are very methodical about maintaining those standards, which means, what in practice, what that means. So I got hired on to be a sommelier, and that came through multiple rounds of interviews. Their wine director, Jeremiah Morehouse, he's no longer with them, but he was a master sommelier at the time. And so, I spent time meeting with him, talking to him about wine theory. I think he gave me an actual written quiz, or maybe it was oral, but of like wine theory stuff. So he was definitely vetting this guy from Ohio. Does he actually know what he's talking about here? But from there, once you pass the multiple rounds of interviews, it doesn't matter what position you got hired on to do at Gary Danko as the front of the house. Even if you're the restaurant manager, you start running food. And you don't stop running food until you're perfect at it. And then you back weight, and you don't stop back weighting until you're perfect at it. And then you can, then you can bartend, you can be a captain, you can be a sommelier, you can be a manager. So I think the system of it allows them to maybe roll the dice on people that maybe other restaurants wouldn't. If you were going to be hired straight on, first day of training, you're a floor sommelier of a Michelin star restaurant in San Francisco, they need to know you have the pedigree to back that up. But a place like Gary Danko, no one's ever going to be in that position. And so if they feel pretty good about you, they can hire you and have you prove yourself.
How different was it between working at Gary Danko and the refectory? Because you had the refectory for so long. Like, what were the big contrasts between the two?
There was a lot in common, honestly. I think Gary Danko had the resources to execute the stuff that we all sort of wished we were doing at the refectory. I mean, just in the money involved, the staffing involved to sort of every single interaction with tables meeting the standards that are set in stone of the restaurant. That's a thing anywhere could do if you pour the resources into it. If you hire enough people to cover all of the gaps, if you have all of the right equipment and, kind of all of those elements. And that's a tough thing for most restaurants to pour those resources into in that way. But Gary Danko was able to do that. And so the nuts and bolts of the job were largely similar, but it was just having that opportunity to execute just constantly.
So then you wind up, I think, doing some wine education, right, for Robert Mondavi. So what led to you wanting to explore kind of the education side of things? Was it just that's the kind of the last part of it? Like you've worked in restaurants and you've done the Michelin thing and you did the winemaking, but there's this education component out there that you hadn't touched on?
That was a big part of it, definitely. The biggest thing, honestly, was just more family time. The job with Robert Mondavi was largely, 9 to 5 hours restaurants are obviously the opposite there. That was what I guess spurred me looking for a position like that. The opportunity with Mandavi was honestly just amazing. The goal of the brand was to sort of reinvigorate itself and reestablish itself as one of the premium wineries in Napa Valley. And I think over the years, the name Robert Mondavi, in the 80s, Robert Mondavi was the most important winery probably in the world. 40 years later, the brand as a whole had been diluted by, Robert Mondavi Private Selection and Woodbridge by Robert Mondavi, which are hugely successful brands and make a lot of money for the company. But it sort of puts the idea in people's mind that it's not a high-end luxury winery. They were looking to really start the process of combating that perception. And so they wanted to bring someone on the team who had very high-end, Michelin star type experience and a broad view of the wider world of high-end wine. The majority of my job was to train our staff internally, wine things, whatever, wine education for internal staff, and to help push the direction of the sort of the hospitality offerings we were giving at the winery in a more luxury realm.
Robert Mondavi, like you said, in the 80s, synonymous with, prestige, high-end wine. Even now, I think probably, because there's so many labels that the name's associated with, it doesn't feel prestigious, right? There's too many different lines. And aside from, obviously, I think everybody would, first conclusion would be, we'll just get rid of some of the labels. But that affects your financials, and that's not something that anybody's really going to sign off on, right? So how do you do that? How do you inject that prestigious level of excitement back into a winery that's fallen flat on like the next generation?
That's a question. If it was easy to answer, Constellation Brands would rehire me for about $500,000 a year. What we were looking at was like multifaceted elements of sort of relaunching the brand. Like, for instance, right now, they've moved their tasting room to downtown Napa from the winery in Oakville. I mean, this literally happened, I think, last week, where there was an old bank just outside of downtown Napa that Stone Brewery had opened a brew pub in several years ago, and they vacated the space during the pandemic. Mondavi just took over that space, and for the next maybe year or two, I'm not 100% sure on the timeline, they will be doing tastings out of there as they do really massive renovations to the winery in Oakville. So I think that's one stage, right? Like, the winery is pretty iconic. If you visited Napa Valley, it's one of the like major stops for a lot of people, and so it'll be interesting to see what they do with the famous sort of arch and tower out front. But it's also a very dated space because it was built in 1964. So there's that. They sort of some of the marketing things. They redid the labels, which was an interesting process to be a part of, because the first round of labels, I think about Anchor Steam, which sadly has just shut down, legendary brewery in San Francisco. They were bought by Sapporo a few years ago, and they redid their labels, and it looked exactly like the Twisted Tea, like cheap Twisted Tea can label. Terrible rebranding. And I feel like the first round of designs we saw for the new Mondavi label was sort of in that direction. And there was a lot of pushback from people that had been working with the winery since back when the Mondavi family owned it. Tons of credit to Constellation Brands, where they took that feedback and they reimagined what they were doing and went back to the artist that had made a lot of the original labels for Mondavi, like in the 90s. I think the same artist that had done the Opus One labels back in the 80s, and did a more modern label that also still had elements of like prestige and classic, harkening back to the history of the winery. So there's all of those like larger in the market elements. My piece of this giant puzzle was, what are we doing for hospitality offerings? Because if you're marketing yourself as a luxury winery throughout the world, and you want to sell people $300 bottles of To Kalon Cabernet Sauvignon when they come visit your winery, that is a little bit incongruous to what the Mondavi winery had been for a long time, where people would show up with families and buy a $15 bottle of Moscato from the retail shop and sit out on the lawn and drink this Moscato and have a lovely time. But that's just not what people, if I'm showing up to a winery, think I'm going to have this very luxury experience and I see that, I'm probably going to leave and go to another winery that fits more of sort of what I'm looking for. We spent a lot of time talking about what that meant in terms of the offerings we were going to have for guests at the winery, training the staff to deliver those a more luxury experience. We got a budget to buy a bunch of luxury wine and taste it with the staff, like a shockingly generous budget to do that, just so they could understand, like, here's what first growth Bordeaux tastes like next to our Cabernet Sauvignon. We did a tasting where we did maybe 10 different wines from the To Kalon vineyard alongside our wine from To Kalon, and here's what those all taste side by side. So you can then have those conversations with customers who are probably that level of knowledgeable, and then COVID happened and all of our plans for hospitality just went up in flames anyway.
Or around this time too, you're doing the education stuff, but you participate in the Wines of Austria Sommelier Cup competition. So what made you want to do that? Not just, participate in a sommelier competition, but one that was specific to a certain region, certain country.
When you are in the sommelier culture in a place like San Francisco, that's just sort of what you do, honestly. There's all these opportunities of, I did the Ruinart challenge, I think a couple of times too, where you show up and blind taste 4 wines and then sit in a seminar from the winemaker from Ruinart Champagne. And if you win, you get a trip out to Champagne, France. And so those sorts of things just kind of pop up. They happen pretty frequently, largely in large markets, especially wine-centric markets, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, LA, Vegas. If your goal is to pass the master sommelier exam, which is like sort of everyone's goal who's summing in San Francisco, they might not say it. They might give up on that eventually and realize you don't need to take the test and I can just do this job. But at a certain point, you're in this culture and you're like, all right, we're all studying together. We're all tasting together. Oh, look, here's this competition for Austria. Now let's sign up for that. I had probably 8 friends also doing it. And here's an opportunity to spend the next 2 months studying just Austria. And when we're done with that, feel like we could pass the Master Somm level of theory on Austria and taste a bunch of Austrian wine and get better at that, even if they're non-CMS testable grapes. So I think that was really just it. Is the culture of it kind of drives you to take part in these things. And if you're already studying and you are already going to go over this stuff in that level of detail eventually, why not see if you could win a trip to Austria while you're doing it?
So what was the general format? Every city is a different region, and then whoever kind of wins that region collectively moves on to next level thing, or?
It sort of depends which competition we're talking about. That one was specifically Austria. So I think there was a written theory exam only on Austria, like kind of all of Austria. And then there was a blind tasting portion of it that was, I think it was 4 wines, and you blind tasted and you wrote down your notes on the wines. And then when you were graded on that, the top 3 competitors went on to a mock service, which again, so it was built like the quartermaster sommelier's exam, except everything was Austria.
So same thing for when you did the Ruinart stuff too? Was it the same kind of format?
That one was only blind tasting. So the Ruinart does it every year. I think they do maybe like 4 or 5 cities. Yeah, show up and it's 4 wines. It's not necessarily the wines that you would expect if you were taking an examination. One of my former colleagues at Gary Danko won the Ruinart challenge maybe 2016. And he told me that all 4 wines were rosés. You have to just blind taste 4 rosés. Good luck. And so, yeah, they do that every year and just kind of rotate through what wines they're pouring for people. And then they take a group of people to Champagne, whoever did the best in their respective cities. And there's so many of these sorts of competitions. There's a like best young sommelier competition. You have to be under 30 to compete in it. that tends to be like a countrywide thing. It's like a regional, and then if you win your region, you compete nationally, and then if you win your country, you can go over to Europe and compete. And then there's a version of that that isn't age restricted, and there's all kinds of them.
I had Jayton Paul on from Vancouver, and he's participating in one that it was regional. He won it, and then it becomes national all across Canada, and people come out of the different regions. But the little thing is that you have to do it in a different language. So he's having to learn French so he can participate in the national, like, best sommelier of Canada competition right now.
I think that one feeds into a worldwide competition, because I had a friend in Portland do that maybe 2 years ago. And yeah, I think he picked French also. And so he was like boning up on his French to be able to compete in this exam. I think it puts Americans in particular at a disadvantage, because if you're a European sommelier competing in this, odds are you speak a couple of languages anyway. I guess if you're Western Canadian, you're only speaking English. Maybe if you're Eastern Canadian, you already speak a little French.
Yeah, that's what he said. Like, most of the people that have ever won this have been from like Montreal or Toronto, like, because they just already know the dual languages. So it's like not even a thing for them. So it's like it's pretty advantageous to be from that side of the country. But so for you, what happens when the pandemic happens? You guys are out on the West Coast, everything shuts down.
I was really fortunate that several months before the pandemic, I had left restaurants and gone to work at Mondavi. So the restaurant shut down didn't directly impact me. And, what tasting rooms at wineries were shut down. I was in a leadership role, so I was still working from home anyway. But have to give Constellation Brands all of the credit in the world, because they didn't lay off or furlough any employees across the entire business. They paid everyone the entire time we were shut down. For their employees in tasting rooms that declared tips, they averaged out something like 6 months worth of tips and added that amount, prorated it and added it to their paychecks. They just fully paid their entire staff, which then when we reopened our tasting room, we were good. We didn't need to hire anyone, unlike everyone else in Napa Valley that laid off their staff and then had to frantically hire. Everything sort of pivoted while we were shut down. California was shut down significantly longer than Ohio was, for instance. We were doing things to keep our staff engaged. I think it was twice weekly. We were doing wine education programs for the staff. Things took the opportunity to deep dive into subjects that would have been difficult to do during operations. I did a presentation on French versus American oak. So it was just like 2 hours of talking to people about why these two kinds of oak are different. That would never happen if we weren't shut down and stuck at home. And so, we did the same thing with grape genetics and microbiology. And I can't even remember all the topics now. The history of To Kalon, remind everyone why it was so special. And then I also did more kind of like front facing video things for the winery, where we interviewed our winemaking team on a live video so people could learn more about winemaking. Or sometimes I leveraged my connections in the sommelier world, brought some master sommeliers on to talk about why the history of Mondavi matters. And that tied into the idea of kind of re-luxuryifying the brand, of let's see if we can get some MSs who are bored and stuck at home to talk about why Mondavi matters to the larger world of wine. So we still kind of pushing elements of that agenda. And then obviously once we started to reopen, trying to redo everything that we had ever known about hospitality at the winery and do it all outdoors, change up everything we were doing. So it was a shockingly busy time, considering I was at home the whole time and not used to working at home.
So is that where the podcast came from? Was that a component of that, or was that a passion project, something that you wanted to do?
Yeah, I think it was just being stuck at home. I need a thing to do, even though I was still working. Once I started doing a lot of the videos and recording, I became a lot more comfortable with the concept. And, I was interviewing people for these Instagram lives. I thought it'd be fun to do a longer format conversation with some people.
Is it something that you felt it was going to have a timeline of it, of just do X amount of episodes, or was it just something that you wound up losing free time, so it was kind of harder to continue to do?
Yeah, I had a son actually. I started the podcast during the lockdowns, like early 2020, and then my son was born October 2020, and that really, had to start prioritizing what I was spending my time on, and the podcast was kind of a fun hobby, but ultimately, it was no longer where I was going to allocate a lot of my time.
Something that you'll consider bringing back eventually, or time and place?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't. It's fun to do. It's definitely fun to like have these conversations with people and sort of like get to learn about people and learn more details of the industry and all that. But I don't think that is, again, now that I am older, have a family, you know, doing some things in the restaurant group that I'm with now, just trying to allocate my time as a resource efficiently.
You wind up taking a wine sales rep position, right, at Skurnik for a little bit. Was that just needed or wanted a job to be doing something, or did you want to explore the side of wine sales because you had never touched on that?
My family ended up moving back to Columbus, and that's where I worked with Skurnik, is here in Ohio. And we moved back to Columbus sort of for family reasons, largely around having a son. Fun fact: childcare in San Rafael, where we were living during the pandemic, we were quoted $3,500 a month. So we live back in Ohio.
I haven't seen them in a while, but there'd be every once in a while. If you're on TikTok, there's some people that would create some videos and they're like basically clipping together, asking people like, how much do you pay for childcare where you live? Boston, New York, and just some of the answers you get, you're just like, that's insane.
It's already crazy expensive to live out there, obviously. And we were in a place where, like, all right, maybe one day, not anytime soon, give us like 7 to 10 years, we could buy a house. We were looking at like Petaluma, maybe buy a house for like $800,000 or something, just aggressively save money. But then we saw the bill for childcare and we are like, so that's all of our money. Like, we can't save anything. We're literally never going to own a house living out here or go on vacation or, whatever. It's just like all of the extra money has to go to that. You combine that with, what, almost like 2 full years of like San Francisco dining being shut down and the constant fires. We didn't even talk about the fires. The fires suck to live through. So yeah, we moved back to Columbus, just easier place at least to raise a family. And then, yeah, I took the job at Skurnik because it was something, it was like the last vestige of the industry that I hadn't done before. It's like, and Skurnik has an unbelievable portfolio also. So that played into it too. Coming from a place where I had all of the great wines of the world at my fingertips, and then moving back to Ohio, I still wanted to be in a space where I got to play around with those great wines.
Would you take a wine sales job like that? Do they give you kind of an established region, book of business, or are you building everything from scratch? Like, how does that work?
It totally depends on the business. Skurnik, at the time, they only had one sales rep in all of Columbus, which is too many accounts for one person. So when I came on board, they kind of peeled off a couple of accounts from the other rep in the city and gave them to me. And then, so my job was, here's whatever the number was, here's 15 accounts to service, and then go prospect new accounts. There's sometimes, depending on the scenario, say there were two reps in Columbus and one of them left the company, then they would be looking to hire someone to move into that established route and take all of it over. Sometimes they'll hire you solely to prospect new accounts. It all just kind of depends on what the particular sort of business is doing at the time.
So when you're in that role, how hard is it to try and get Columbus restaurants, Columbus wine directors to try something different than what their usual order is? Like, Columbus has grown a lot as a restaurant and food city and everything, but there is still a solid chunk that is, and we've talked about it with numerous guests, but I won't go over X amount of dollars for this item. I like this item. This is the item I want. Don't change that item. Why did you change the menu? You took away this thing it's never here anymore. Like, so how do you approach that, knowing that there is this element of stuck in the mud consumers that don't want to change? They like what they like, and that's what they want when they go out in their free time. to also try and get new products or new wine into those establishments?
To be totally honest with you, I don't think I'm very good at that. I think that's largely why I'm not in sales anymore. I had a handful of buyers that I worked with that really did want to like get a new product and educate their guests and kind of push what we were doing with wine in Columbus. And I love those people. And I probably spent way too much of my time talking to them because it felt like an outlet, That's when I met actually Taylor at the refectory now. When I moved out to California, that was years before he came on board at the restaurant. So when I came back, I took over that account and I met Taylor, became friends with him there just because he would buy all the cool stuff that we had in our book. And so it was fun to kind of bring that up to him. A lot of my accounts or my prospective accounts did have a lot of pushback because they had a lot of those clients who wanted what they wanted, and it wasn't worth the effort from the business to try and break them out of that. Just bring in the product you can sell and get it to them. And I found that incredibly frustrating to deal with personally. Nothing against the buyers; they're just trying to do their job and run a profitable wine program, be it retail or restaurants or whatever. But I like I said, I had the entire world of wine at my fingertips in the Bay Area, and then I came back to Columbus, and there's this tiny corner of the world of wine that would sell very well and very easily, and everything else just felt like I was, hitting my head against a wall of bricks. And clearly, there are sales reps in Columbus who do this successfully. I'm grateful to them, but that is not my skill set, unfortunately, for my time at Skurnik.
So how did you wind up at Agni and joining Avishar and his restaurant group?
I heard they were opening. I was looking around for opportunities, and I emailed Avishar's other restaurant, Joya's, and said, "Hey, I think you guys are opening this other restaurant soon, and I'd be interested in having a conversation and doing cool beverage stuff with you." And the person who was answering the emails at Joya's is this woman, Nicole Vanderdoes, who had been a sales rep for Cavalier Distributing here in Ohio. And I had met her when I was at the refectory. When I was buying, she called on me as a rep. And so she passed my information on to the Agni team and said, "Hey, this guy actually knows what he's talking about with wine. You should really sit down and have a conversation with him." Super grateful to Nicole for the introduction there and not just taking my email for, random crazy person off the street. Once I started having the conversations with Avishar and his team, it became pretty clear that they wanted to do something pretty special at Agni, and I wanted to be a part of that. And they liked my vision for what we could do with beverage.
I wouldn't say that there's a centralized theme to Avishar's food. Maybe you could say, Bengali because of his heritage and everything, but it's kind of all over the place in a good way. It still works as a theme. I mean, they have a tasting menu there at Agni, and it still flows nicely. So, but with that, how much of a challenge is it to pair wine with a cuisine that doesn't fit your prototypical category or box? Like I don't even know what you would compare it to necessarily. I mean, even your fine dining Indian restaurants in Chicago, New York City, or whatever, it's not in those categories, but it's not in fast casual either. It's kind of its own pretty unique thing. So like, how hard is it to go about creating, a pairing list or a wine list that pairs well with a lot of the food?
Like our current menu right now, we have influences obviously from Bangladesh. We have influences from American fast food, from Oaxaca, from Peru, from Vietnam, from Sichuan. So it's definitely not, I agree with you, like sort of like there's definitely a thread of Bengali flavors through the whole thing, but there's nothing traditional or no box you could put the food in for what we do at the restaurant. And at the refectory and at Gary Denko, the refectory was 100% French food. Gary Denko was, California cuisine, which is basically French food with some Japanese flavors and local California produce. So definitely like way outside of the realm of what I professionally had done before. Like I'd mentioned, I grew up mostly outside of Portland, Oregon. and spent time living, obviously in California. So outside of work, I probably eat South and Southeast Asian food more than any other, geographical location of food flavors, because those are kind of, it's easy to do that, let's say on the West Coast, if that's the kind of food that you enjoy. The options are out there. So I was pretty familiar with the flavor profiles coming into the job, just on a personal level. So I had a rough idea of what way I wanted to go for things, but it definitely has been a challenge. It's not, there's no book, there's no reference guide. I can't just go, if I'm stuck on something, I can't Google, hey, what pairs with egg chot and onsen egg and, Ohio maple yogurt sauce with pickled asparagus stems. Like no one else is making that dish. There's no map to follow. But that does, it makes it fun. I think after what I've been in the wine industry, in fine dining or wine production or education for like 20 years now, and to stay engaged and stay excited about it, having a menu like Avishar's and the team at Agni's helps me keep that excitement, where I'm not going through the motions, because if I tried to go through the motions, I'd give someone a terrible pairing. It takes engagement on a day-to-day basis and trying to hunt down the right unique wines to go alongside the menu.
I've noticed with pairings, it's not the traditional thing that you think would work that works best. So like Mexican cuisine, like it's ironic that there's a lot of wines that aren't from Mexico that would work best with Mexican cuisine, and but some of it still works. French food, French wine, you can have the kind of classic pairing. But is that kind of similar? Which one does it kind of skew more towards for Agni's cuisine and the pairings that you come up with? Is it usually kind of the wines that you wouldn't expect would work best with the cuisine, or is it you find like French wines wind up working best because of whatever, versus you would think maybe like Austrian wines would work better? Or
yeah, there's that idea, what grows together goes together, right? I've never subscribed to that. Like I said, one of the things I love about wine is the opportunity to study history. And so like spend a lot of time reading up on the history of wine. For most of the history of cuisine and wine together, nothing was intentional about it. It wasn't like an intentional pairing. You just grew wine and you drank it, you grew food and you ate it. And that just was what was happening in the area. It wasn't 2,000 years ago. No one was, actually, that's a lie. 2,000 years ago was at the height of the Roman Empire. So they actually were doing this. Call it 1,000 years ago. No one was thinking about food and wine pairings together, especially because wine, pre the theory of microbiology, wine would only be good for like 4 or 5 months, and then the next 4 or 5 months it would taste like vinegar, and you would still drink it because it was the only thing you had on hand, and then you would load up again in the next year. So the idea that what grows together goes together has never made sense to me, because the grapes have been there and the product has been there for so long, it predates any concept that we should have these things together, which I think having that as my mindset is probably helpful, because there, like you said, I can't just pull out Bengali wine or Vietnamese wine for my pairings. And there has been a lot of unexpected things popping up. Our final savory dish on the menu is a duck dish. That's, it's like everything you could have from a duck all on one plate. And in the world of French food, when you think about pairing with duck, immediately start with Burgundy. Like that's the go-to. Have some Pinot Noir with this duck, and then maybe you can go from there. And maybe if it's a richer duck dish, you'll go into like a Grenache or something like that. But that was the hardest dish from our menu for me to figure out what to pair with it. Like I tried all these different things, it wasn't quite working. And what I eventually landed on that worked really well was a super fruit forward Napa Cab, which, that was like option 15 of what I was trying with the duck to try and nail down this pairing. But once I had it and I saw the way that the flavors and the texture of the wine and the spice of the dish were all working together, then it opened up, the whole Rolodex in my mind of all these wines I've experienced opens up of, all right, if Napa Cab works for these reasons, now Chateauneuf de Pape can work for a similar reason, or Australian Shiraz can work if we're finding the right wines. So I think it's been a lot of like trial and error of trying to figure out those components of what works. And I think often it is unexpected, but once I'm able to hit on it, a lot of opportunities pop up to pour cool stuff for people.
How often does the pairing does it change as dishes change, or does it change just because inventory on something that you're using runs low, you can't get any more, so you got to find something else to kind of swap in?
What I've told people is it changes probably irresponsibly often. Like I said, I like to be engaged at work and I like to be excited about things. And so that means cycling through wines and opening up new stuff and seeing how slightly different wine works with a different dish. And also having the opportunity personally to just try different wines as opening it up. So I spend a lot of time trying to source wines that aren't widely available. And that means sometimes I'll only get 6 bottles of a certain wine in, and then I use those for pairings and they're gone. And I need to change to the next wine. There was a night a month ago where I ended up pouring 3 different wines for the same dish just because of how busy we were, how many pairings were ordered, how much wine we ran through over the course of the night. So I think there's a plan of, like a flow chart of once we go through this, we'll move on to this and then move on to the, wine number 3. But it does change really, really frequently, which also I think if you're a guest and you enjoy wine, it can be exciting for you too to, have dinner with us one month, have wine pairings, come back the next month, do wine pairings, and I'll pour you 7 totally different wines than you got the first time.
So for you, like you mentioned, when you're out in San Francisco, everybody there is secretly studying for the master, whether they want to admit it or not. Where are you at with exams? Because you've mentioned a couple times, reaching that point, and we've had a lot of people that talk about it that reach this point where I don't need to do any more exams because I've done enough to know that I can do the job that I want or the career path that I want. And getting more certifications isn't going to help me complete that task or advance that aspect of my career. So I'm assuming that's kind of where you're at with it too, right? Like you reached kind of a level and you still want the knowledge and stuff, but maybe going about certifications is not the best way for you to obtain additional knowledge.
Honestly, with the Court of Master Sommeliers, in October of 2020, there was an article that came out in the New York Times about like rampant sexual harassment and abuse of power within the Court of Master Somms. It involved a lot of people that I had met and interacted with in the San Francisco sommelier community. The court is based in Napa Valley, right? And so that's just kind of the hub of all of their operations. And I found everything that was in that story to be pretty disgusting. And in protest, I mailed all of my CMS pins and certifications back to the court with a pretty strongly worded letter telling them how I felt about the way that kind of everything had been handled. So I definitely am not testing through the Court of Master Somms for further certification. I've taken the WSET level 3 since then, and I've thought about maybe going on and doing like the diploma and maybe the Master Wine to follow. That could happen one day. It's in the back of my mind. It is one of those things that is a serious time commitment, though. And like you were saying, I don't think there is benefit to my career in the same way that it would have been if I was a bit younger and more kind of in a entry level kind of wine position. It would I would be doing it just for, I don't know, internal validation, I suppose. And so that's a lot of money and time to spend on something like that. But it's always in the back of my mind. I should keep pursuing that maybe. So one day it could happen.
One thing that doesn't get touched on is that it's really location dependent. I feel like if you are in San Francisco and Napa Valley, carries a little more weight because it is a differentiator because there are so many wine programs and restaurants there where maybe here in Columbus, there's not as many. So while it'd be cool if you were, like the only master sommelier or working in restaurants in Columbus, how much of a difference that would make, it's hard to tell. I guess we won't really know the answer until somebody actually does it. It doesn't feel like it would make a gigantic difference. Aside of maybe like there's a little bit of a bump for like a month because of press or something like that,
That's likely that you would see that bump, and that would sort of be it like a month or two later. And yeah, in terms of like career advancement anywhere, any job that there's no job in Columbus where people would take me more seriously about my wine experience because I had the MS letters. versus like my actual real life work experience. But it is definitely, I had passed the certified before I applied to Gary Danko. I never talked to them about this, but I almost guarantee like they would never have called me in for an interview coming from a restaurant no one's ever heard of in Columbus. If you're in San Francisco, no one knows what the refectory is. So if without that level of certification, I don't think I would have gotten that response to my resume.
Is there a wine region that you kind of gravitate towards? Pretty much everybody has one region that, for whatever reason, when they started getting into wine, that was it that clicked. You mentioned Chablis earlier, but I don't know if that is the region for you or if it was something else.
Yeah, I think all of Burgundy, which is easy to say because Burgundy is fantastic. There's the saying all roads lead to Burgundy, but for me, Chablis was that first wine that clicked for me. So I started out in Burgundy and never left. And at Gary Danko, the opportunity to sell Burgundy was outrageous compared to what you see in other markets. I think in the 10 years that I worked at the refectory, I sold one bottle of Domaine Romani Conti, probably like I think it was a Grand Echezot or something like that. So one bottle in 10 years. I spent 2 years at Gary Danko. I sold 24 assorted bottles of Domaine Romani Conti. So averaging about one a month. And that's just one high-end producer. That doesn't count the Coche d'Ury, the Laflèvre, the Ramonet, these high-end Burgundy producers that aren't even available in Ohio, frankly. And so I was already into Burgundy. It was already, sort of my favorite region. Like I really enjoyed it and I spent a lot of time studying it. And then I ended up in a place where I sold and tasted so much great Burgundy. And now I have the wine taste of a billionaire, unfortunately.
Are there any lesser known or underrated grapes that you believe deserve more recognition? Yeah, everybody knows Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and all the big ones, but there's a lot that are little small, little areas that are grown. This is the only area that they're grown, or maybe there's 5 little areas in the world that they're grown. Is there anything that falls into that category that you think people should try more or be drinking more?
Yeah, absolutely. So many of them, honestly. I think for a long time, I really went down the rabbit hole of Trousseau. I'm a big fan of Trousseau, and specifically United States West Coast Trousseau. I think that's one of the few grapes I think the U.S. does a significantly better job with than its native regions in France. And like throughout Sonoma, you can find super cool plantings of Trousseau, and it's this very ethereally light-bodied red wine, super floral, all kinds of spice notes. Every tart red fruit that you could come across, blood orange and cranberries and like red apple skin kind of flavors coming through. And it's such a cool wine. It's super versatile across a number of different foods. You can have it with a little chill on it in the summer, on the patio. And there's still so little of it being planted in California and Oregon that I don't think a lot of people have come across it, but I just absolutely love it. If I was ever going to make wine, this would not make any financial sense to do, but I would want to do 7 single vineyard Trousseaus and just that would be my lineup. Like people do Pinot Noirs throughout Oregon, they focus on single vineyard Pinot Noirs. I want to do that with Trousseau and then probably never sell any wine and close the label up in 2 years.
What part of being a sommelier is the most fun for you?
When you see someone click food and wine together and how it sort of makes sense and why the profession of a sommelier really exists. You can see it on their face. Every single time it happens on their face because it's this almost visceral reaction to the flavors and the combination going on that just kind of opens people's eyes to how special a combination of food and wine can be. For the opening menu we did at Agni, we had a dumpling, a Sichuan style dumpling in chili oil. And the pairing that I did for that was Bud Light, because traditionally, if you're in Sichuan, China, you're probably going to have local rice lager with your spicy dumplings. So we were talking about that and all right, local beer, made out of rice. I mean, this is Bud Light we're talking about. Like, why not just give people Bud Light? And the amount of people who said, over the course of the like 2 months, we that was the one pairing I never changed, by the way, was the Bud Light with the dumpling. The amount of people who said that that was the best Bud Light they've ever had, when all it was just the same Bud Light you've ever had in your life. It was like 50% of the tables like commented on how great this Bud Light tasted. And I thought that was always super cool of you can take the most mundane beverage and put it in the right light, and people understand that there's something different that you're doing here.
When you get the chance to go out to dinner, do you compulsively check the wine beverage list to see what they have, or are you just able to separate yourself?
Oh yeah, I check it before time so that way I'm not boring my wife at the table, because I've already looked through the full beverage selection instead of flipping through the wine list while she's just sitting there waiting for me to be done.
What do you think is the next wine region to explode? We've had a few different answers for this. So we've gotten, Mexico, certain areas of the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, the Finger Lakes, Michigan. Is there one, around the world that you think is on the come up, but still kind of underrated, but everybody should be paying attention to over the course of the next 5 years?
Michigan and the Finger Lakes are probably really good choices for that. I spent a lot of time looking through the Silicon Valley Bank wine report. Rob McMillan, who's the head of their wine division, every year compiled this super data intense wine report. And the trends that you see over the last several years is that basically like light bodied high acid white wine and sparkling wine are by far the largest like growth movers within wine across like all price points. That kind of falls in line with a lot of the best of what's done, I think, in the Finger Lakes and in Michigan. The West Coast, I think there's just so many barriers financially. The cost of doing business out there, the cost of land as you get into Michigan is like, maybe that's where I need to start looking to start my Trousseau wine brand, because it's actually approachable. And I think anywhere you can look that outside of the classic like super expensive fully planted wine regions where you can get sparkling wine and like crisp bright whites for reasonable prices. I think that was Ria Spicious in Spain 10, 15 years ago. And now Albarino went from a unheard of grape to pretty common. And I think something along those lines is probably where we should be looking.
Columbus is still a beer town. You're still a beer guy to some extent, I'd imagine. So do you think the city's drinking habits are shifting at all since you've been involved? You got 20 years in the business. Do you think things are moving towards something else? I mean, for a time they moved towards the alcohol seltzers, but according to all the data, those sales have kind of dropped off, even though they still sell a lot of it. But Columbus is a drinking city. What do you see?
I work in a pretty small segment of the Columbus drinking scene, I think. When I was interviewing with Avishar and his team at Agni, I told them my experience at the refectory, if it taught me anything, it's that there's a market for people who really love wine in Columbus, and it's a market that is largely untapped. It's the refectory, it's maybe like a couple of other places, obviously like Veritas and Chapman's and Commune all have fun wine programs, but they're not like deep, extensive wine programs in the same way that you would find options like that in New York and San Francisco and Chicago. And a lot of diners that we have at Agni, that I had at the refectory, travel to all these places and drink great wine at nice restaurants in all these places. So I've always been a firm believer that there's a large untapped demand for serious wine programs in the city here. So I want to be a part of that growth as it continues, and as the venture capital money and Intel and all that brings more tech business into central Ohio. There's a lot of people who, like me, spent time in the Bay Area and then came to Columbus for whatever reason, and are bringing that dining and drinking experience with them. I don't know if that's really going to move the needle in a serious way. For our tiny 9-table restaurant, like that's enough for us to be largely successful. I don't know if that is going to be the same, broadly speaking. I think Columbus is always going to be a beer town. I think drinking, I guess apparently not Bud Light right now, but drinking Modelo on a football Saturday and you're tailgating, like wine's not going to replace that. Cocktails even the ready to drink cocktails, I don't think are going to replace that. I think that is really at the heart of what, kind of the culture of Columbus more than anything is built around like football in the fall. And if you're a part of that, you're probably drinking beer, and it's probably like something you can buy a 24 pack of, drink consistently throughout the day, and not a 11% triple IPA. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
What's next for you professionally? I mean, you're running the wine program over at Agni, but anything else on the horizon?
I'm excited to stay with the team that Avishar's put together. And it's funny, apparently he's lately been getting questions of like, oh, I heard a rumor you're opening a third restaurant. We don't have a third restaurant. It's not going to be, he opened Joya's and then 6 months later opened Agni, or almost 6 months into Agni. That does not mean there's a third restaurant opening up anytime soon. But we definitely all as a team have goals of what we would like to do and further projects for the foreseeable future. I'm going to be a part of that, and I'm going to do what I can to help our little restaurant group, keep pushing great food, super fun beverages in Columbus. And one of the things that really drew me towards working with Avishar, coming off a Top Chef, he got all these offers for investment money to go open up restaurants wherever. And he was adamant he wanted to stay in Columbus and only took the investment dollars that let him stay here because he thought we could be seen as a dining destination city, and he wanted to be a part of that. So I think that's the next step is what can we do to keep making Columbus a dining destination.
Most people probably don't know, and I mean, Avishar was on this podcast, but the way he explained it, like Joya's wasn't even supposed to be Joya's. Like Joya's was supposed to be like a window. Like it's just a window on a wall. Like they would cook stuff and like, yeah, your order's ready. It gets passed through and that's it. Like there wasn't supposed to be an inside. Yeah. Like that's how that started and just evolved into something else. So I'm sure he'll eventually, come up with another concept and open something, but it's definitely too soon.
That man has a lot of concepts in his head for sure. There will be things in the future that we try and do and try and work on. Nothing that there's like an imminent. But yeah, apparently he's getting stopped like semi regularly, being like, "Oh, you're opening a third restaurant?" Like I don't know why that word got out, but
handful of questions left. This next question comes from Chef Jonathan Mazzara of Gem City Butchery out in Dayton. It's also you can find him at Jollity and some of his food on the menu at Silver Slipper Wine Bar out there too. He's a previous guest on the podcast. He left behind a question for you. What's the best thing you've eaten this year?
Best thing I've eaten this year? It's a really good question. I think this might just be recency bias, but I had dinner at Novella Osteria in Powell, like the northern end of Columbus recently. They had this tomato, peach, and burrata sort of caprese-esque salad on the menu. And I think the tomatoes came from Hirschberger Farms up in northern Ohio. The peaches came from somewhere local. I think it was somewhere different. And it was super simple, and it was like perfectly fresh produce and just delicious. And I think that's the best of what Italian food can offer is just perfect produce on a plate, just with the right amount of acid and salt. And that's what stands out to me as the best thing I've had this year.
What's a question you want to leave behind for the next guest? Can be anything.
If you weren't in this industry, what do you think you would find yourself doing?
Next question comes from one of our listeners. They wrote in, but is there an Ohio wine you'd recommend?
The best Ohio wine I've had is Marco Vineyards. They're up in Geneva, like right on the lake. And I had probably like a Spätlese level ripeness Riesling from them that was about 18 years old the time I had it. Unbelievable. I mean, it's not just the best Ohio wine I've ever had, but I mean, it would go toe to toe with great Riesling from any serious Riesling wine region in the world. After that, I became a pretty big fan of Marco. I think most of the great Ohio wines come from that sort of like Geneva on the Lake area in northeastern Ohio. There is a project being worked on in Lancaster right now that the former winemaker from Mondavi, the winemaker that I worked with when I was there, she is consulting on a winery project in Lancaster. And I know they've planted a couple of hybrid varietals and some Cabernet Franc as well. And I could not be more excited for what's going to come out of here because this winemaker, her name's Nova Catamadre, and she's super smart. She is a master of wine. She got her viticulture and enology degree from Cornell. She would not be attaching her name to something that she didn't believe could be quality wine. So something to look forward to in probably like 3 or 4 years. She left Mondavi and now she has a small winery actually up in the Finger Lakes called Trestle 31 that makes some really, really delicious Riesling. I know she has consultation projects in Napa as well. So she's still doing work over there. She has as good of a track record as you can have in this industry. And those are not the people that you see working in wine production in Ohio usually.
So this last set of questions we asked to everybody who comes on the podcast, nice compare and contrast for the listeners across all the episodes. First question, who would you say is the biggest influence on your wine, your sommelier career thus far? You look back on it.
Be Jeff Alasky, the former wine director of the Refectory.
What is your desert island wine?
It's got to be some champagne. Let's say Cru Grand Cuvée.
Restaurant you recommend that isn't your own. Person gets stuck at the airport, flight canceled, stuck overnight. You guys aren't open. They reach out to you. Hey, where should we go eat? You point them in this direction.
Ooh. Is it cheating if I say Joya's? It's
not the restaurant you work at, so no.
No, that's the restaurant I personally eat at more than anywhere else in Columbus. So, I mean, I'm probably just going to send you to Joya's or go to Fox in the Snow for that egg sandwich.
We eat at Joya's a lot, and two reasons is, one, we have a 15-month-old, so you're limited on time and what you can do. Two, also, there's not a whole lot of places that are open for lunch anymore post-pandemic. I mean, and that's any major city. I mean, San Francisco, you see it. New York, like it's hard to find places that you can go get lunch from. Like it just is.
Well, and especially working nights like we do in this industry, a place that does a killer like brunch or lunch, so you don't need to wake up for breakfast hours to go get it. I mean, that's gonna hit for industry folks every time.
Bucket list travel destination, bucket list restaurant, place you never been to, you still want to visit, place you never eaten at, but you still want to dine at one day.
Travel, I actually, despite the fact that I absolutely love Burgundy. I've never been to Burgundy, so let's say Burgundy as a whole, and bucket list to eat at Pujol, Mexico City.
Craziest thing you've seen happen in a restaurant while you're working?
Gary Danko, we had this probably safe to assume homeless person come in and ask to use the restroom, and we let her like just, yeah, sure, why not? Go use the restroom. And then she's in there for probably like 30 minutes, and then she comes out just fully naked into the dining room, just walking out and like yelling a bunch of stuff too. That was definitely not the vibe we were going for at that restaurant.
Did she leave on her own accord, or did you guys have to call the police to come get her?
We called the police, but also I think she left, but no one wanted to really like touch her, obviously. So it was like, hey, we need you to like stop doing everything that you're doing right now. Gary Danko used to, I'm sure they still do, they would give very generous like discounts to people in public service, so like firefighters and police. I think both because they just wanted to give back to the community, but also that meant that a lot of the San Francisco police have eaten basically for free at Gary Danko. So we got our calls responded to real quick.
Food or drink guilty pleasures. Is there anything, fast food, candy, whatever that you know is unhealthy for you, but you just can't help yourself?
Lately, it's been Mexican Coca-Cola, like the stuff made with cane sugar. We have that at the restaurant for a cocktail that we do, and it's just sitting around. It's real hard to resist.
All right, so this next one is wine recommendations. So we broke it into 4 categories. So it's 0 to 20, 0 to 50, 0 to 100, and over 100. So if you have 3 that are under $20, you can fit one in each of those categories. So you don't have to go, between 20 and 50 for the second one. So this is just things that you think people should be drinking, that they can find, people that are interested in wine, expanding past your Meiomi or whatever that you're going to find in the grocery store on the shelf there. So first category, 0 to 20, what do you recommend?
I think any Chocolina. So white wine from Basque Country in northern Spain, Chocolina. Most of it that you'll see will be under $20. And just as a rule, it's like slightly bubbly, it's bright, it's fresh, it's kind of salty, it's delicious, great with most seafood, great with summer weather. I drink it in the winter too, though. I think 0 to 50, I don't know. I would probably look into the Willamette Valley and do some Pinot Noir from the Willamette, probably just because I grew up there, but Patricia Green is one of my favorite producers. I don't know if this is true, but I've heard they make more single vineyard bottlings than anyone else in the United States. I think they do like 30 different single vineyard Pinot Noirs. So there's a huge wide range of what you could get from them. Their entry level Pinot is probably around $30 retail, and then they kind of go up from there. And it tastes like home to me.
0 to 100.
Now it's starting to get a little interesting. Champagne should get good grower producer champagne. Something like a Pierre Giminet, Blanc de Blanc. That won't quite push the 100. That's probably 60 to 70 or something in that range nowadays. It's hard. The retail pricing, I don't know off the top of my head. Killer 100% Chardonnay, small family-owned winery, and it is delicious. And everyone should treat themselves to some legitimate good champagne every now and then.
And then over 100.
Over 100. I think whatever style of wine somebody likes, if that's cab, if it's Pinot Noir, whatever it is, they should, if they're willing to like really, really splurge, just go buy obscenely expensive bottle of like the best sometime and just experience that. You know, if you drink Napa Cab, I don't know, if you really wanted to go for it, spend the money on like Harlan, which is probably like $1,000 a bottle now. But Harlan Napa Cab it is so good. It is like, I don't know if it's worth the money, but there's a reason that it costs that much, and it is in a lot of ways justified. If you love Pinot Noir, go get, spend $1,000 on some Grand Cru, Bon Mar from I don't know. No, Roumier is more than that now. So she's laying Barthod or something. Grand, and whatever it is you love, like just save up the money, put a little aside, and go Google whatever you need to hunt it down and just find the best of the best and really see why people are willing to spend 4 and sometimes 5 figures on these bottles of wine.
What is one book focused on beverage you think everyone should read?
If you are in the industry and you want to be really great at beverage, you should read Setting the Table by Danny Meyer, which is about hospitality, not about beverage. But I think people early in their career, when they get power over being a buyer and writing programs and wine lists, they make the wine program that they want to drink at, and they forget that they should be making it for their guests. And I think Danny Meyer's philosophy on hospitality is helpful to keep in mind for that.
I'm an Anthony Bourdain fan, but not everybody is or was. If you were, is there a moment, episode, scene that still stands out to you about him? If you weren't, is there anybody else who was on TV, Julia Child, Emerald, that you always kind of gravitated towards when you were coming up through your career?
Yeah, I think I was definitely a big Bourdain fan, and I don't know about an episode necessarily, but there's this quote that I just happened to have, so I pulled it up, that I think is always stood out to me from Bourdain. Is you can always tell when a person has worked in a restaurant. There's an empathy that can only be cultivated by those who've stood between a hungry mouth and a $28 pork chop, a special understanding of the way a bunch of motley misfits can be a family. Service industry work develops the soft skills recruiters talk about on LinkedIn: discipline, promptness, the ability to absorb criticism, and most important, how to read people like a book. The work is thankless and fun and messy, and the world would be a kinder place if more people tried it. With all due respect to my former professors, I've long believed I gained more knowledge in kitchens, bars, and dining rooms than any college could ever hold. Could not be more applicable to my life.
Where can people find you? Social media, website, reservations, plug everything.
Yeah, my social media is just Krauss.Jared on Instagram. That's the only thing I ever post really on. But everyone should come check us out at Agni, dineatagni.com, Dine at Agni on Instagram. We've only been open for about 5 months now, but I think we are doing a ton of cool stuff. We are pouring cool beverages. Our wine program is what I would be running if I was running a wine program in San Francisco. We're not in any way sort of cutting corners because we're not in a large market. So, and it's the same thing with the food. Avishar would be putting out this menu in New York if he opened the restaurant there. So I think Talk is how you can book reservations. So go to exploretalk.com and search for Agni and book a reservation, and let me pour you some champagne.
Yep, you guys are open Wednesday through Sunday, 5 to 11. A la carte menu at the bar is available. Bars kind of walk in too, and then there's a chef's counter that you can book too if it's open for reservations too. But we've been there. We had a great time. So yeah, we'll be back. We usually wait for a handful of dishes to change over. We're one of those people. We're few and far between, but we just keep an eye on like the menu, and then once enough of it has changed, we're like, all right, we're going back. And we just kind of rotate through a bunch of different restaurants and stuff. That's how we approach it. But
Late September, we're changing the menu again. More like fall flavors coming through. So you have to check us out in the fall.
that's right around the corner. So yeah, looking forward to that. But it's not pretentious. It's a cool space, cool atmosphere. Yeah, we had a great time. You know, it was our first time there, and it exceeded our expectations, which was really impressive too as well. So couldn't recommend it enough to people looking for a new spot or place that they haven't tried or whatever. But yeah, otherwise, yeah, we'll be seeing you soon then with the menu changes, and stay in touch. Let us know if you need anything. But, otherwise, thank you for coming on. We'll be seeing you soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Big thanks again to Jared for coming on the podcast, taking some time out of day to chat about his career and wine, the industry at large, being back in Columbus, Agni, all that stuff. So again, you can follow him on Instagram. It's at Krauss.Jared. Also make sure to follow Agni. It's at DineAtAgni. One word, no spaces, no underscores, anything like that. You can check out their website too as well. They usually change over the menu a couple times a year. They just start going through a new change now. So it's pretty much all going to be updated, tasting menu, all that stuff. And you can do reservations through the website, Talk or Talk's app too as well. Check out our website, spoonmob.com. Make sure to follow us on Instagram. We're just at spoonmob. We're on all the other social media platforms, except for Threads. We never did that. Mainly it's just we put up an update on TikTok in advance of whatever the next episode is that drops. We usually do it like Wednesday nights. So you can get a little bit of a preview as to who the guest is. So you can follow us there. Our handle is just at spoonmob on that. We'll pop around Reddit from time to time. Don't really do much with Twitter. Don't really do much with Facebook. Facebook is just kind of incorporated into the Instagram because they're owned by the same company. So when we post something on Instagram, it just goes to the Facebook page. But you can find us there too as well if you'd like. And then, yeah, the website too. But appreciate everybody who's been listening. Appreciate everybody who's been spreading the word, writing in questions and feedback and recommendations and all that stuff. So awesome to see. Do a mailbag episode. I have a lot of questions that have been written in that I haven't been able to incorporate for one reason or another into a guest episode, whether it's something that comes up naturally in the conversation, it's something that's already been asked, it's something that doesn't fit. So there are good questions in there, just we haven't been able to put all of them into an episode. So I might just blow those out, like knock out a bunch of them and just kind of do a mailbag. Some of them have been directed at us too, as well as to kind of like, what's your dream guest and all this stuff. So be on the lookout for that. We might just drop that as like a mini update episode or something. Try and keep it around like 30 minutes or so if I can, but tinkering with that idea. So we might throw something up on Instagram, see if that's something that people would want to listen to. Yeah, that's it for this week. So again, appreciate everybody who's been listening. Make sure to go vote for us. Best Community Partner, Ohio Restaurant Association Industry Awards 2023. Just go to their website or use one of the links that we have posted and make sure to throw us a vote. Have through the end of September for that. But otherwise, if you're new here, welcome. If you've been here for a while, thank you for your continued support. And we will talk to you guys next week on Thursday.